And we're going to move right into workshops. So up first, we have proposed changes to JICD, academic honesty.
All right, very good. Good evening, everybody. Nice to see you all. Joined this evening as we work through the set of policies this evening by a couple of our esteemed staff. So appreciate Courtney Graffias for being here, our technology integration coordinator who has done a lot of work on our technology-related policies, and appreciate Tyler Schwaller for being here, our student equity officer, for his work on our harassment and discrimination policies. So what we'd like to do this evening is, preview the proposed changes to both, all 5 policies and for the technology ones, their related procedures, before they come up for vote and approval on June 18th. What I'd propose is that I'll do a little bit of high-level summary of the, context and changes for the 3 technology-related policies. So the academic honesty, student and employee use policies, and then pause for questions there. Courtney will be available to help respond. She's very knowledgeable on these pieces. And then we'll tackle the 2 harassment and discrimination policies. All right. So first, policy JICD, the academic honesty policy. This one was not actually on our initial work plan, so we're getting the exceeds, for this. But it was relevant, and kind of outgrowth of just the way the world's moving, and the recognition that it was time through the work that Courtney had been doing to that first bullet with a group of staff that we needed to articulate a stance. And across the state, there's a range of the ways districts are responding. A lot of them are just, waiting and seeing what happens. There's some that are banning the use of it. And as you see in our policy, we're taking an approach and believe that this is, as with many technological innovations, one that we will have to contend with, and that our responsibility as a school district is to teach responsible use. So that's what's informing our work. So out of the work group that, Courtney has been leading, have helped to inform some of these policies and have begun initial training with our leadership as well as staff, particularly at the high schools, to build their knowledge about generative AI and the implications around that. So in the context of the academic honesty policy, where this question comes up, frequently, and part of what emerged is to adopt the, so the changes in the policy. We, as we have with other policies, tried to do a little bit of framing language that drew from our PPS instructional vision, and then incorporated language around the appropriate use of generative AI. So those are the changes we're proposing in the academic honesty policy. Moving, and I'm going to do all 3 of these again, so we'll come back if you have questions about any of them. The student use of school-issued computers and internet, we wanted to update as well. So what you see here is, well, first, just a little bit of background and a reminder. All secondary students are assigned a one-to-one Chromebook device, which they can take home. Parents and students must complete the PPS computer use agreement before they're able to take them home. At the middle school level, they have them for the academic year and then return them at the end of the year, so they do not have them over the summer. At the high school level, generally they're issued upon their enrollment in high school, and then kept as long as can be through graduation, until such need additional devices. At the elementary level, we're provided for devices for in-school use, and there's a different version of that kind of computer use agreement. So just part of what we do to provide knowledge, advanced knowledge around kind of the terms of the policy to students and families. In terms of the policy and procedure themselves, in terms of as proposed revisions, the policy itself has minimal updates, but we we've added a reference there for clarity to the student cell phone policy and kind of other personal electronic devices. If you'll recall, we did work on that about a year and a half ago in terms of updating some of the guidance as it related to middle school. And then we, in terms of the consistency, part of why this is a batch, added the language around generative AI and the use of kind of third-party platform terms and our expectations of kind of adhering to the guidance to some of the prohibited uses in the procedure. As we look then at the employee, so for the employee computer use agreement, first, just a quick little background. So all new employees sign their employee computer use agreement at new employee orientation or when the device is issued. And we provide, devices for folks relevant to kind of their work role. Educators are provided orientation to kind of the software catalog. So over the past few years, kind of pandemic and beyond, Courtney has led a body of work to really solidify our student data privacy agreements, and thus then what are the apps and the actual things that conform to that and are appropriate for educators to be using. Prior to that, it was a little Wild West and people using kind of whatever, apps and things on the internet that they'd done. So that's a little bit broader background. But in terms of the policy and procedure, which we hadn't updated as recently, so we had done some work on the student one, kind of at the onset of COVID. But here we're adding language, similar language to the third-party services. We added some language regarding our filtering technology that we had included in the student one in the prior update. And then we updated throughout because it has been some time and the range of devices that it's relevant for has kind of changed. So updated some of that language to kind of what's more relevant now. And similarly, updated some of the prohibited uses to kind of conform to current kind of issues. The last update, I believe, had been 2010 off the top of my head. So that's a bit of the overview of our proposed changes to that set of kind of three policies, the academic honesty, student and employee use agreements. So I'll pause there to see if there are any questions about any of the specific policies or changes.
Go ahead.
Thanks for the presentation. I just had a question about, there's a lot of, it lays out all the rules and regulations and everything and talks about what students need to compensate for any damage of computers, but is there any information on what would happen if someone were to violate any of the policies? Because I didn't see anything that was like a student will lose access to a computer if they do a certain thing.
That's the references then to just the general kind of code of conduct ones, so it really depends on what that violation is, right? And is treated kind of under the discipline policies. So here it's setting these are the things you can't do with the computer. And if you violate some of that, then we'd apply the kind of our school discipline policies.
Okay, thanks. And then second, I kind of have a more general question, which might be a question for a different time, but are students, is there any information going out to kind of the general student population that these policies are being modified? Just because there's not a lot of, prior to my time on the board, I didn't really know about policies being changed, and I feel like it would be beneficial to have a meeting or something discussing why, AI is not allowed, why it's a bad thing, just maybe giving more information to students and teachers in general would be helpful.
Yep. I'll say a couple things, and then I don't know, Courtney, if you want to speak to anything of kind of thoughts about, we're just beginning the AI engagement and building educators' capacity. But just in terms of general notification, that's part of the intent of obviously the agreement, signing for the device. It doesn't list the same depth, obviously, as the procedure does, right? But references that. So there's some, expectation and onus for, students to know what's going on. It's also included in all the student and family handbooks. So that's another piece. There can be other, kind of engagement, but those have been the primary ways, that we kind of communicate just generally about the kind of expectations and the policies related to that.
Thanks.
But yeah.
Hi, I'll go ahead and speak to your question about generative AI. And in the policy, it talks about allowing generative AI if the teacher allows that in their assignment. And so your question was about asking or teaching students and then also staff. And we have that planned for the beginning of the school year during August Institute to be able to work with high school teachers regarding that so that when they start with students in September, they can include that in their syllabi and their back to school policies and information. So that will be in either a class or it will be in advisory.
Okay, thank you. That's
Sure.
really helpful.
Great questions. Board Member Victor?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I just wanted to thank Courtney in particular for the academic honesty policy and the changes with respect to generative AI. I've seen, just in so many districts struggling with how to approach this, and I think this language, just looking at the actual changes in the policy, are spot on. And so I just appreciate having this approach to not trying to close students off from a technology that's going to revolutionize how we all, or is revolutionizing how we all interact in the world and are empowered and prepared. And so just really appreciate all the work that went into getting us to this point. And I really look forward to seeing, I don't know if it's already being implemented, if some classrooms are using generative AI now, but I'm certainly looking forward to seeing it starting next year. Thank you.
Vice Chair Bondo, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Just a clarification here on the computer use agreement, and we sending them in secondary and elementary. Do we have those on the different languages, or we just in English?
Yeah, no, I just included the English example for the board docs version, but yes, as required, we have them in multiple languages.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
I know that there was a lot of conversation at the committee level around the word device and just like what is inclusive of a device. Would you mind speaking to all the things that are under that category that students might use?
I'm trying to remember that conversation.
You on the spot. This includes Apple Watches and anything that uses the internet, basically, right?
Right. Yep. And that's where there is a little bit of this policy are school issued devices, right? So things in that category are likely to be computers, computers and, tablets of some form, right? The policy around personal devices. So that's the JFCK, that's cell phones, Apple Watches, all of those things are spoken to under that
Beautiful.
policy.
I just wanted to make sure the board also heard that fully. Beautiful. Any other questions from the board? Okay, I see no hands here. Oh, I do see one online. Board Member Billiou, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Aaron, can you just, sorry, I think I might have misheard, but can you just confirm if Courtney will be doing trainings on those programs?
Yeah, we're beginning at the high school level. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. That's great.
Beautiful. So I think that wraps up these three policies. Thank you so much.
Great. Okay, we'll move to our second kind of batch of policies, if you will, that are up for consideration, and appreciation to the Policy and Curriculum Committee for adding on some additional committee meeting time last time to incorporate our look at this policy or these sets of policies. Again, this was not, we actually updated the employee one earlier this year, but the context for both of these is that the Biden administration released their updated Title IX rules. And so we're beginning to address that through the enactment of the changes in these policies. There's a federal implementation deadline of August 1st. So thus we needed to prioritize getting these kind of on our collective calendars, this month so that we could roll through and have the updated policies on the books by that deadline. So excited to be meeting that. We are definitely working in partnership partnership with our colleagues at Drummond to make sense of it and incorporate it formally into our procedure. So what you'll see tonight here are proposed revisions to both policies, and we will do continued work on revisions to the procedures over the summer, and we'll bring those back for information. There's some pieces that, we may bring forward because they're substantive enough that we may, ask for approval around them. But there's a lot to work through. Drummond and, Maine School Management Association have yet to even produce model policies and procedures yet. So we're working kind of side by side with them as this gets developed. But in the context of the policies in front of you, first, as folks may recall, we did major revisions to the student harassment and discrimination and sexual harassment policy in 2020 with the goals of strengthening reporting pathways and, fulfilling our obligation to kind of respond promptly and equitably to those reports. As I just mentioned, the new Title IX regulations are effective August 1st, and those really expand kind of the scope of Title IX jurisdiction and kind of raise some of the expectations in terms of training and response. So if folks, some of what that means in that first one, just because I do appreciate Drummond's help with this at the time, that we had kind of a set of concentric circles around which the different levels of both the federal restrictions, what's enshrined in the state's Maine human rights law, and then separately at the board level, what we considered, inappropriate conduct. And so fortunately, the distinction between the very tight, narrow federal circle and kind of the state circle is being resolved somewhat with these new regulations. So thus, that's one of the updates, is kind of revising and clarifying the definitions within the policy. It's specifying some additional training obligations, and then wanted to highlight, and we, kind of had a, discussion for some time with the policy committee that we've included some language. Part of the new proposed changes includes an opportunity to designate some employees within the system as confidential employees, so that students could report to them. Obviously, they're still subject to mandated reporting responsibilities, so it does not kind of alleviate them of those responsibilities. But our prior policy had said all employees will report within 24 hours, any instances of harassment, sexual harassment, and discrimination that are either reported to them or they observe. But there is some consideration, and we wanted to leave the language in. It would be designated who and how those would be, identified in the procedure. So we felt that at this time, what made sense was including language because it didn't commit us to the designation of confidential employees, but it allowed for the opportunity to designate confidential employees through the procedure, that we have kind of maintained that language, or we've added that language here in the policy. So that's on the student side. Let me speak to the staff one because it's fairly similar here briefly, and then we can pause for questions on that. So again, we revised, I guess it was just in February, to align with the student harassment and discrimination policy, ACAA, also impacted by the Title IX revisions. So there are a couple of similar themes of change in terms of revising and clarifying definitions, specifying kind of training obligations. Different in the staff one, though, is providing some additional protections pertaining to pregnancy and related conditions that are required under the new regulations. So we've adopted new language there, and some of the changes that we discussed at the committee level are part of this draft. So that's the overview of the proposed changes to the student and staff harassment and discrimination policies. And if you want to come up for questions, we'll open the floor.
What questions do board members have? Board Member Opperman?
Maybe you could speak to a little what the confidential person is in relationship to social workers or not social workers and that sort of thing. It might be helpful.
Yeah, and I'll let Tyler speak to it. He'll do so much more eloquently than I. And I would consider this for the full board, folks that weren't part of this conversation, a little bit of just kind of like stuff to think about over the course of the summer before we come back to the procedure.
So the Title IX regulations themselves spell out a few categories of people who might be designated as confidential employees. The first category are the most obvious, those who, by virtue of their jobs, like social workers, potentially counselors, depending on sort of state laws, who, as a part of their jobs, may hold information confidentially. They also would carve out an opportunity to designate people as confidential employees who, by virtue of their specific role, it might make sense. So it doesn't necessarily have to be connected with particular a sort of like a formal position like social worker. What we're thinking about right now is social workers primarily. Those are the people who are best trained and equipped to understand what confidentiality means, to have the conversations with students. I did some just sort of informal polling of social workers this week, and those who responded, I mean, all of them were very positive about the idea of being able to be designated. And for them, it was just a no-brainer. They said, this is a part of the work that we do. I always have the conversation with students about what it means. That what they share with me, I may have to report under certain circumstances. So it could theoretically be broadly designated depending on who we think makes sense within their role to be confidential. But in terms of our first approach, we are just thinking about social workers because of their specialized role.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Any questions from the board? Member Grant, go ahead.
Just first a question and maybe a comment, depending on the answer. But as I read the proposed policy, this just has to do with the reporting, not the what happens next part of the process. Am I right about that?
Yeah.
Okay. Then I'll just offer a comment, benefit of the wisdom of my day job. I would just encourage the district to really train up the people who are the deciders when it comes to actually doing a Title IX investigation. I've seen far too much in other districts with other employees just getting in hot water over sort of a defensive practice in this area. Because once you quote unquote start a Title IX investigation, that really opens up a can of worms for whoever, whether it's viable or not. So just I would encourage you to issue some good training about, when do you really need to start the investigation? What triggers that? And not just, anytime something comes in that says Title IX, everyone freaks out and launches an investigation. That can have some very detrimental impacts to people, even if it's found to be untrue, especially if it's found to be untrue, excuse me. So I just want to flag that for the people who are doing the training.
And I'll just respond by saying, personally, I'm excited by the opportunity of these new regulations because they give us a chance to do another round of training and to have greater alignment across the district in how we respond. And it really is that first initial moment of reporting that we need to get good at. And I think we are getting better at having that initial conversation, figuring out what pathway are we going down.
Totally understand that. Thank you.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Is there a record kept of any violations of these policies so that we can ensure that they're addressed in the correct ways? And if they aren't, then we can make sure that they are in the future?
Yeah, we have both state and federal requirements to kind of document allegations of harassment, sexual harassment, and bullying. So we have reporting requirements. Schools are expected to document those, even allegations, even if they're ultimately not substantiated in Infinite Campus, because that's part of our federal reporting requirement. And then we also maintain our anonymous reporting system, which obviously, as anonymous is more difficult to, kind of track within those formal means, but is another tool that we've had over the past couple of years to start to track what's happening.
Okay. And is there someone at either the school level or the district level who is overseeing any violations within these policies? Like if it gets to a certain point or a certain severity that somebody is, consulted who knows how to deal with it professionally and in the right way?
And that's really Tyler's role. So, I mean, ultimately, school administrators are charged with this responsibility, ensuring that, all of these policies are supported and enacted. And we've done significant work over the past couple of years to ensure, in what Member Grant is referring to, when there's an initial report, right, that they're accessing, the expectation currently stated is that's reported within 24 hours. And so that we can provide that kind of responsive guidance. And that's one of the things I'll say just for consideration as we think about the confidential employee issue, right? Part of our move around the revisions was to strengthen reporting and to be able to monitor, right, more clearly.
Yeah.
And there may be, reasonable spaces where the confidentiality remains important there. And I guess what I would wonder and consider as we explore that, right, is how do we still maintain some level
Right.
of oversight and monitoring and reporting, right, without violating confidentiality, if that's possible, right? I'm not sure,
Right.
but recognizing that there's a tension there with some of the efforts we've been making over the past couple of years to have a clearer sense of what are the issues our students are facing.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Vice Chair Banda, go ahead.
I see on both for the students and employees, I see the specified training obligations. So those are the different ones, right? So the student is a different trainings obligations, and for the staff employees is also a different ones, or some are just aligning to the same direction. And who does those trainings?
Yeah, so they're actually they're stated in both policies, but they're particularly pertaining to employees. So we don't have an obligation to ensure that all students are trained. I mean, that's a part of, we want to inform students of what recourse is available to them. But it just lives in both policies because as a matter of, in the student policy, the reason we say we will train employees is that this is a matter of ensuring that we are communicating to employees their responsibilities to address issues related to students. And that happens in multiple ways. So under the new Title IX regulations, all employees must be trained annually about obligations under Title IX. And so that's likely to happen both through the sort of a kind of initial overview when teachers return in August Institute, but also we use the Vector online training platform that enables us to track when people are keeping up with their trainings. And then depending on people's roles in the process, so like somebody who's investigating, somebody who's the decision maker on a Title IX complaints, those all have specialized trainings that I either do or we work with Drummond and they support our training of staff members. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, Board Member Figdor, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Chair. I had a couple of comments, and first, just in respect to the designated confidential employees, I really encourage us to keep it as narrow as possible because I do, like, as social workers, makes a lot of sense to me. I want to make sure that we don't designate school leaders. I think there potentially is a conflict of interest there. I think the reporting is really critical, and we've made such strides in that. So, this is just at first blush, and I will give it much more thought. But I do think that the value of having the data is so critical. There are instances, absolutely, where that confidentiality is so important, but it feels like the people, best positioned to adequately resource those students are the social workers. And then my other comment is just more broadly, when, we first embarked in, 2018 to 2019, to really overhaul this policy. I don't know if the board, many board members are aware, but we did it as a result of a student who came to the board probably over a period of 9 months or a year even, appealing to the board to do better, to keep students safe. And at the time, we were really, when we did take this on, we really struggled to work around the completely inadequate federal rules. So it's just, it's just sitting here thinking about how much progress we've made, and that we figured out how to have a, board policy that was even more protective than federal and state law. And now it's great to see it coming full circle, that we're actually given more tools to use so that we can do this work well. And just wanted to say thank you to Tyler for all your work heading everything you do to head this work up. It's so critical.
Board Member Figdor, Opperman, go ahead.
My comment is only on the training. I'm not having done that every year for multiple years, and how it's presented is critical to whether anybody listens to it. I always sat down, but I know people who turn it on and walk out of the room. So just to be careful.
And just to remind, we've had a role at the building level, folks designated with, again, some additional training to be able to receive reports, and, students and families can report to any adult in our system. But in order to strengthen reporting pathways, there have been folks, and they've been involved, and I imagine we'll be able to tap moving forward some of that to be able to do, when we did the initial kind of rollout of this, it did, kind of deeper work then.
Okay, any other questions online? I would just like to use also this opportunity to just plug the anonymous reporting form on the website. It's at the bottom of the homepage. In addition to just making sure folks know to reach out to a trusted adult, or if staff would reach out to HR. Is that correct?
Correct.
Beautiful. So thank you for all your work on this.
Great.
Okay, let's do strategic plan next. And
Chair just made a run for it when it comes to strategic planning. Chair mentioned this, but I just want, because this is Deputy Superintendent Townsend's last set of policy workshops, is just want to acknowledge just a thank you for the shepherding of all of these policies and all of this work over the last year. To think that at the beginning of this year, we were going to go through all of these and to get caught up, people would have thought it was crazy. And you have done it with not just a deft hand, but just really through your leadership of bringing everybody along. Just truly appreciated, and just a credit, because we are here now because of your leadership. So thank you for that. So tonight I'm going to give you an update and a first read on our new strategic plan that you will be voting on June 18th. A reminder that we began the strategic planning work at the beginning of the school year with Attuned Education Partners. On the left, you can learn a little bit about Attuned. They are a national organization that supports districts across the country to develop and build strategic plans that have been effective at not just improving districts, but improving outcomes for students in both large and small districts. And on the right, you can see the 5 phases or the 4 phases of the work that we've gone through in this process. The first was around laying the foundation and making sure that we had a thoughtful strategic planning process. The second was the organizational diagnostic to make sure that we knew both the strengths as well as the opportunities that we faced in Portland Public Schools, and to recognize that we weren't starting from scratch with this work, but that we were building off of the work that has taken place both within the Portland Promise as well as other work. The third phase was the strategic planning phase and the development of the strategic plan, and that work happened not just with the feedback of the board, but within our steering committee, with staff, with students, with feedback throughout the community. And we are now in the early beginning phases of phase 4 as we start to think about how we will monitor and build implementation plans for this work. The strategic plan is, again, not designed to start from new, but is designed to realize our mission. And so it didn't start from starting with a new mission, but started with this mission. Just highlighting a couple of pieces here. It starts with making sure that we understand that we're responsible for ensuring a challenging, relevant, and joyful education that empowers every learner to make a difference in the world. That it ensures that we're building relationships among families, educators, and the community to promote the healthy development and academic achievement of every learner in our schools. In phase 2, with the building of an organizational diagnostic, we examined 3 primary sources of data, and you had the opportunity to look at a very in-depth organizational diagnostic that identified key organizational strengths and challenges. Those 3 sources of data included performance data analysis of both state assessments as well as other assessment data, instructional quality review, including looking into the classrooms, and then constituent perspective that included a pretty in-depth listen and learn series, as well as surveys and other opportunities for folks to provide feedback, including focus groups with board members, with members of the community throughout the process. That organizational diagnostic identified key strengths that we have in Portland Public Schools that we should make sure that we recognize and that we build on. And while there's 5 on the screen, there were many more that were identified, but these were 5 true strengths that we wanted to make sure that we built off of. The analysis also identified gaps. And through this process, it pushed us to really recognize where we had things that we needed to make sure that we addressed in our strategic plan. And sometimes that required that we really sort of like have the difficult conversations about where we have areas that we need to address. Because if we're going to truly achieve our mission of making sure that all students leave us prepared and empowered, that means that equity isn't just about process, but it is about outcomes and making sure that students truly are achieving at an equitable level. And so that brought us to the work after that organizational diagnostic of putting together a steering committee that was 16 members across the community. It included 2 board members, a small number of central office staff, school-based staff, both school leaders, teachers, an alumni, a student, members of our community, parents, as well as community partners to help us develop a strategic plan. And as part of that, they identified and developed 5 strategic priorities for PPS. One of the exciting parts is if you've been here for a number of years, you'll recognize that there's some familiarity to these priorities because many of them existed in the Portland Promise. And so they're not starting from scratch. But the 5 priorities are equity, keeping equity at the center, achievement, enhancing academic excellence and equity, whole student, connected community, cultivating inclusivity and belonging, people, developing staff, leaders, and organizational culture, and then systems, streamlining operations for equity, efficiency, and accountability. Within each of these priorities, the steering committee identified initiatives that were aligned to each of the strategic priorities that are sequenced over the duration of the 5-year plan. And so in each of the slides that we're going to go over, on the left, you see the priority. And on the right, on the top of the slide, you will see what's the focus initiatives for year 1. And below, you will see the initiatives that roll out in future years. It doesn't mean that that's the only thing that is happening in that year within that focus of work, but it does mean that that's where there's such a level of intentional work that you should see significant movement within that. And while it doesn't talk about it here tonight, we have looked at in the past about how we think about initiatives within 3 phases: a design, an implement, and a monitor. And so as you're reading the verbs that it talks about within this, and as we look about in future slides, you will see it talk about develop, implement, and monitor. And so within equity, next year, the initiative that is a focus is develop and implement a plan to advance staff mindsets and cultural humility in support of equitable outcomes and experiences for our students and families. And if you look below, you will see 3 other initiatives that come into focus in years 2 through 5 of the plan. In the second priority around achievement, you see that there's 3 initiatives that are a focus for next year. Well, that's a lot. And one of the things that we have to wrestle with within this strategic plan is the amount of work that it calls out in year 1. One of the things that was intentional within this strategic plan is that instead of there just being a lot of new work in year 1, there's a deepening of work in year 1. And so the first focus there is around K-5 and 6-8 ELA. This is work that our academic team, Deputy Superintendent Townsend, and our network teams next year will be taking on and continuing around EL and CKLA. The second is around continuing and strengthening the high school redesign process. That is work that was started and will continue. And then the third is around developing the capacity of schools to provide more effective instruction to students with disabilities across the continuum of services. This is probably the one that feels like the most new in terms of really going deep. And then below you can see 2 initiatives that will be deepening work. The third priority is around whole student, connected community, cultivating inclusivity and belonging. Next year, the initiative is to go deeper and a focus around increasing the capacity of schools to create and implement whole school systems, SEL curriculum, and relationships that promote a joyful, supportive, and safe school culture. And below that, you see 5 additional initiatives that are focused of the work in years 2 through 5. The fourth priority is around people, developing staff, leaders, and organizational culture. And so this initiative focus for next year is really around refining and implementing a shared vision for a strong and inclusive staff culture where staff are valued, affirmed, effective, and supported. In its most simple terms, this is really about defining our values. What does it mean to work at Portland Public Schools? How do we work together? What is our collective commitment? And how do we show up? You can see below 3 additional initiatives that our focus is in years 2 through 5. And then the last priority is around systems. This is really, how do we make sure this work happens? And how do we make sure this work has lasting impact? You heard some of that actually tonight when we talked about the SOPs and the staff hub. And so next year, there is 3 initiatives that are aligned to this. The first is around continuing to build and strengthen our data team and our data infrastructure to make sure that we're not just doing this work, but we're making sure that it has an impact on student outcomes. And so we're measuring progress along the way. The second is that as we've done this shift in central office capacity, that we are clear around responsibilities and decision-making, and in particular around how it differs between the central office and the schools. And then the third is that we have a multi-year financial model that is sustainable moving forward. This is one that came out of the budget process this year that is addressing Maine care and the redistricting question. And so that's what's getting captured there. That's a new one that was added based on that. And then you see the 3 initiatives that are multi-year afterwards. So that's what we have there. And so those are the initiatives that are called out in the strategic plan. And here's another way to look at it if you want to see them all together. These are, I believe, the 10 initiatives. If I have the count right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yep, 10 initiatives that are the focus next year. It's a lot. And if there's anything that I would encourage the board to consider is not about what's missing here, but about how we could potentially consider what to move from year 1 to year 2. And I realize that's a very difficult piece, but this is going to be a stretch. And so just something to consider, or something that goes from a year 1 to a year 1 and a year 2. Just something to consider as we're thinking about this. We also talked about in the retreat, and I want to share an update about the measuring success. So we actually started this presentation a little bit backwards. We talked about what is the work we're going to do over the next 5 years. Where we should have started was, where are we actually trying to get to in 5 years? And how are we going to measure success? And so let me share with you the mission measures. These are what we're aiming to achieve in the next 5 years. And so what you can see on the slide, they're a little bit small, so I'm going to read them on my screen here, are the measures that we looked at in the retreat in April. I'm going to share like a quick update. You can see that the mission measures on the left, you can see the baseline value, the target, and then the rationale that we worked with Attune to establish on how we set them. There's a number that are TBD, and I'll talk through each of them just in terms of why they're TBD and when they'll shift from TBD to being finalized. So the first is around the percent of students graduating from high school in 4 years. That number has declined or was on a slight decline. And so the goal here is to reverse that decline and to remain above the statewide average. The second is the percent of students, graduates enrolling in college. We had talked about in the retreat about wanting a different proxy on that. Right now, we don't have another great proxy that we could use that would capture things like students who enroll in a post-secondary professional training program or get into a living wage job or other things that we value. And so we needed to settle on something that we have a measure for. It's possible that a measure may become available in the next couple of years. If it does, as a collective, we could switch it, right? And so this isn't locking it in, saying that we can't switch it, but right now we wanted something that said, what do our students do when they leave us? And this was the best measure we could come up with in working with Attuned and the data that was available. The third and fourth measures got at percent of students proficient in ELA and math. The test has changed. And so we're waiting until July when we'll have, we believe, the official data from the state to set the final goal. And so we're just waiting there so that we know what the trend line is to be able to set it. And so we'd come back to you to say, in August, here's what we got from the state. And so we'd look for your approval at that point to set a 5-year based on the trend line. The next one is around the percent of multilingual learners showing growth on English language development. And so this is a slight change that came out of the discussion with the board, where we decided to shift it from the percent of students that achieve proficiency to the percent of students achieving growth. And this was to make it more encompassing, because there's a very small number of students that actually achieve overall proficiency. And so instead, we wanted to recognize that if a student was an ELD level 1, but achieved their growth that Access said was the growth that they should achieve, that we would recognize that. And so we wanted to have a measure that did that. I don't think that's lowering the bar. I think that's actually setting the right trajectory. And so wanted to do that. And so we're actively working to gather that data and put those measures in. And so we'd come back to you with that. The next two are things that we would use the next year to baseline because there are new measures for us. And so the first one is the percent of students completing advanced coursework in high school, whether that's advanced placement, dual enrollment for credit, approved vocational technical kind of program. This is one that, if you remember the conversation last time, I think the language was around participating in, and we changed it to like completing successfully. And so that's the goal here. And so we'd be working with Infinite Campus, our own side of Infinite Campus, just to figure out how we're going to tag that to be able to do it.
That's just a very specific question on that. So for that is, with respect to AP classes, does that mean that a student would have to take an AP test? Because I know some of our students opt not to take those tests.
I think we could define it either way. We could look for guidance from the board
Okay.
on whether we want to define it as either an AP test or a letter grade in the course.
Okay. I would encourage us not to push students to take the test when that might not be the right outcome for them.
Yep. And then the last one is there's such research around the importance of students reading on grade level by the time they get to third grade. And so we are moving to M-Class to use as our literacy test. And so that is a new assessment for us. I think one school used it this year. And so we just need to test our students on it next year to figure out the baseline to then set a measure on it. And so that's what's happening there. But that really gets at the question of, are our students reading on grade level when they get to third grade? So that's what we're looking at there. Okay, so those are the first set of mission measures. There's a second slide that we're going to talk through. So on the second slide, we get at another set of mission measures. Again, trying to be careful to not set too many that we dilute the value of any of them or we become overwhelmed with the number that we're looking at. So here we get to culture and belonging in school. So the first is around the percent of students reporting that they have an adult that they feel connected with and that they can go to for help at school. The next is around that gap and making sure that we're paying attention to and aware of that gap and making sure that it doesn't grow. This gap here is small, but on survey data that we collected along the way and that Attune collected in the organizational diagnostic actually pointed to a pretty wide gap. And so that's why it's called out here. The third is around chronic absenteeism, recognizing the challenge that we have around chronic absenteeism. And then the fourth is around gap closure. And you see gap closure numbers for students with IEPs, multilingual learners, and economically disadvantaged students. There was a piece of the conversation that came up when we did our step back around whether or not 10% gap closure was the right number for each. And I want to address that for a second because we didn't change it in the proposal based on the feedback. And I just want to talk about why. First, based on the trend data that we had, the gap was actually widening currently in terms of our multilingual learners, because that was actually the part where it was particularly talked about. The second piece is that the gap closure is on top of the overall improvement. And so just to put this in context, right? So the first thing we're setting is a goal about our overall student population improving on English language arts. So it's probably going to be a goal that they improve, let's just say for ease, right, of 15 percentage points across the 5 years. That would be all students overall improving, right? That would include multilingual learners. If we then on top of that have a goal that the gap closes by 10 percentage points, that would mean that on average, our multilingual learners, the gap or their performance would improve by 25 percentage points over 5 years. That achievement, right, if we looked historically, and if we looked across the state, and if we looked across the country, would be historic, would be significant. And so one of the things that we want to do with goal setting is make sure that it is both ambitious and achievable, because we don't want folks to write off the goal, because otherwise what happens is it sits on the paper, it sits on the shelf, it sits on the wall, and doesn't actually drive behavior, because it becomes the sort of thing where people say, we know we're not going to hit that. And so we also wanted, because we have so many goals here, we wanted something where folks knew what the goal was around closure and could talk about it. And so we made the trade-off. And again, at the end of the day, you guys are going to vote on it and make the recommendation. But we wanted the trade-off of people knowing that it was 10%. And overall, we're still talking about a significant improvement. And if 3 years from now, we're on track for that and we want to be more ambitious, then let's double down. Let's do that. I'll be the first person to say, let's go further. But what I want to be careful of is not to put such a big number out there that nobody moves and nobody makes the movement with us. That's the thing I want to be careful about. And so that's the caution that I have here. And so those are the mission measures. So hold on one second, because I'm going to put, I think one of the questions you have here, we're going to get to in 1 second. And so just for context setting, right? The mission measures are the 5-year goals. Those are the pieces that say, this is where we want to get to in 5 years. They're kind of our North Star. The priorities are the big buckets of how we're going to get there, right? And they're the same big buckets that we saw in the Portland Promise. And then the initiatives are really in some ways the updates of saying, based on the last 5 years and where we're at now, what are the right work? What's the right work to get us there? So North Star, mission measures, the big buckets of work, and then what's the actual actions that we're going to take in the next 5 years? Within those, that piece of work, we need to know that we're actually implementing it and that it's having impact. So we need to measure ourselves along the way, right? So if you were on a diet, right, you may say, by September, I want to lose 30 pounds. That's your mission measure. And you're going to go to the gym and you're going to eat less. But what we're going to talk about now is how we're going to know whether we're going to the gym enough and whether we're eating too many calories. Those are what we call our initiative measures. So I want to share those real quick with you. So we call those our internal measures. And so we're also going to track internal measures aligned to each of the initiatives to make sure that we're tracking towards this. Okay? Because you don't lose weight by weighing yourself every day. You lose weight by making sure you're going to the gym and by making sure you're eating less calories. And so for that first initiative, I know this is what happens. Like, remember that meeting we had a long time ago where we talked about a boat for a long time?
Let's go
Remember
back
that?
to the boat.
Yeah, we're not there. Okay, we don't need to go back to the boat. But here we are. So for each of the initiatives, there's a small number of measures that we are measuring and keeping track of throughout the year to say, are we doing this? And so the first initiative was that one around developing and implementing a plan to advance staff mindsets. And there's 3 measures within that we're keeping track of. One is the training and the actions we're taking supporting leaders to feel better equipped to support equity work within their staff. The second is that work helping teachers and staff report that they feel encouraged to engage in learning around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then third are the staff actually participating in it? So that's the idea here, is how are we implementing it and is it having impact? Within K-5 and 6-8 ELA, the idea here is, are we actually seeing the curriculum implemented when we do walkthroughs? Are they implementing not just the curriculum, but the lesson plan structure? And are students, as a result, able to play back in their answers and in their discussion high-level responses that show that our instruction is producing more rigor and responses? And so what you can see through here is how we're monitoring our progress along the way. That's how we're doing it on a regular basis. So when board member Bondo asked earlier today, she asked Dr. Ahmed and Dr. Atkinson-Duino, right? How are you going to track if folks are doing observations? If that was actually an initiative next year, right? We'd be talking about what's the tracker and how many observations are done. It's the same type of idea here, but that's what we're looking at. And so you can see that within each initiative, you can see the trackers, the measures that we're looking at. And so within climate, right, there's 2 climate measures in 3.1 on the next slide that I just want to highlight that aren't in the mission measures, but are in the internal measures that we're tracking. One of them is around TFI score, and the second is around suspensions. And so there was this internal question around how do we decide whether it sits on the mission measure or does it sit on the internal measure? And we want to make sure that suspensions continue to trend. They're down about, out of school suspensions are down a little bit under 10% right now, year over year. And so we wanted to make sure that we continue on that trend. We want to monitor it. It's also a sign that our school culture is working. But we also wanted to make sure that our mission measures were framed in a way of positive. Kids want to come to school. Kids are at school, not in an adult action piece. So that's why we did it here and not in the mission measure type idea. And so you can see within each of the slides that you have the internal measures that we're using. And so these internal measures are really designed for staff and for myself to make sure that we're holding each other accountable along this work. And so with that, I will pause and see what questions you have. Yeah.
Board Member Figdor.
Thank you so much, Chair. Thank you so much, Mr. Superintendent. I had a question about 5.3, the new goal around, it's not goal. I will understand. I will get the terminology
That's right.
New priority. There we go. Around building a sustainable financial model. I wonder if that it absolutely, and yet how you articulated it was very narrow.
Yep.
And I know that that narrow is better right now as we have a proliferation of priorities and initiatives. But I do wonder if it makes sense to include other big pots of money like title funding, because, or you could say the EL hardship funds. These pots of money where we're getting, we're getting federal or state money. It might not be aligned to our budget season in terms of the EL hardship funds. And we need internal accountability to ensure that we're spending that money as it was consistent with the purpose of why we got that money. So that's my first question.
So I would say 2 things to that. First, I mean, we can certainly broaden it. There's an underlying assumption, right, that we don't do that. And I would test that assumption, right? So I do think that we do follow title rules, and I do think we follow the funding rules around what EL needs to be spent on in the same way that we follow the rules around what COVID needs to be spent on. And so I don't think it's a need for a strategic plan focus because I don't think that's an area of concern. I do think there could be a question around if the board felt like there was a broader area, but I don't think there's an area where we're not right now matching up with what the regulation says.
Okay. I mean, that's not my understanding through the budget process. If you looked at the spending per pupil when we looked at the title funding, clearly there's lots of variables, but even when you tried to explain away all the variables, there was not, it was some of our title schools were getting the fewest, we're spending the fewest resources per pupil. And then on the EL hardship funds, like right now, the articulated process in our final budget was to move those into reserves without a clear plan for how we are going to ensure that they went to our EL students. So I'll leave it at that, but I I, as a board member, do not feel confident that we have those those pieces all, tidied up. I'll move to my second question, which is around the internal measures and specifically with regards to the point you raised about suspensions. And so looking at suspensions as an internal measure, not a mission measure. And I understand your explanation, and that makes sense to me. I just want to make sure that we're including both out of school and in school suspensions, because I know we've seen a big move from out of school suspensions to in school suspensions, and those are still suspensions. It's still taking kids out of the classroom where they can't access grade level material. So I think I want to make sure that we're capturing both. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. I actually think that we need to really dig in on the question of in-school. I think that the work that was done last year around the alternatives to suspension opened what I'm going to describe as a little bit of Pandora's box around the use of in-school suspension that has become a challenge that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and I would love us as a board to take that on. I think that work is really critical. And but just to confirm, so we can articulate that reduction, that internal measure is going to include both in school and out of school suspensions.
Yeah, I'm happy.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's fine.
And then I have a couple of bigger picture questions. So I don't know if I can hold those for now.
I mean, I think that we're generally taking questions across the board now, so I think you're fine to ask them.
My question is about whether this strategic plan, and I think this is a great plan. I really appreciate the process and Attune's leadership and collaboration with us, and I think this puts us in a really strong place moving forward. I'm wondering if our intention is to call it the Portland Promise 2.0, and if not, why? There's such an understanding in our community, throughout our buildings, among our families and in the community about the Portland Promise and what it stands for. And this is very much aligned to that. It's a continuation of the work, which I know was always the intent. So I'm wondering if I haven't heard it being talked about that, but I certainly think there's a huge value in our families, our staff, families, and community understanding the work that we're undertaking.
Do you want to respond to that now, or you want to keep getting questions?
I mean, I'm completely open to it. I actually think that there is a range of feelings, just to be honest with you, about the Portland Promise, and intent very much positive and feel good. In terms of outcome and seeing the change in outcomes for students who are multilingual and diverse, there's less positive response. And so I think that is where I can't stand up here as somebody and say that that's universal, right? And so I think that is a question that it'd be good to have some more engagement on. That has not been a conversation. I think what people have felt good about in the engagement is that it doesn't feel like a group came together and said, let's start from scratch, right? I think it's good that people said, let's continue the work. I think that what people have also reacted to is the question about whether or not the nature of the promise has been met. And so I think that's the question that it's worth continuing to wrestle with, and what the right name is, and whether it's as important to have a moniker or a tag on it as much as it is to have the action under it. And that's where I don't know. I think that's worth some community engagement on.
And at one point we had talked with Attuned about a potential, like how this will be packaged and that part of that would have like a narrative that would address kind of how this is in relation to or not with the Portland Promise. Is that still part of kind of what this package would look like?
Yep.
Okay. Go ahead.
And just to say, the initial Portland Promise was not a plan to be achieved in, 5 or 7 years. It was, it was a reorientation of our district, and that reorientation of the district is tremendous, is a tremendous amount of work that we continue. And so I hear you. I also think it captures, as I said earlier, it captures the kind of work we're trying to do. But I understand that there's complexity to it. I still think there's value in it.
Did you have another question or was that?
Yeah, just is there one place where there are final versions of this where at least until we roll it out to the public, that the board can access? Just noting the version on board docs is different than the version that you presented to us. I just love to have wherever, when we're ready, I guess, I guess maybe that's next week's meeting.
Yeah.
So yeah, that answers my question. Thank you.
And just to be clear, the actual substance in terms of initiatives and mission measures, they did not change. The equity slide was missing, just it got deleted. And so there was just a cleanup of that.
There
was another
financial sustainability.
Oh, it may have been missing at the end, but it got added. But in terms of the actual substance, it's there. And in terms of the 2 slides, the 2 additional decks that say, here are the initiatives and here are the measures, they're the same.
Yeah, I think it's on slide 12 that there's just a discrepancy. So I think we can just upload the one that's on board docs. But I think maybe when the board update this week, if we could do just like a suite of the final materials for people to review before the meeting, I think that would probably suffice for what you're asking for, which I think is totally doable. Any other last questions? Okay, beautiful. Go ahead, Vice Chair Bondo.
Thank you, Superintendent. I'm going to the mission measure.
Yeah.
I understood the 10% gap. Then you just talk to try to cut for each gap by 10% point. That's the starting point. And I really understood your realistic approach when you just brought us 10. So can we just have an overall what we see now in our achievement gap around all the baselines? What we have right now?
They're actually on the slide. It says baseline there. So the gap right now between students with IEPs and students without IEPs in ELA is 31 percentage points.
Okay.
Math is 22 percentage points.
Oh, I see.
Multilingual is 40 in ELA, 30 in math. Economically disadvantaged is 20 and 21.
Right. So, but I think maybe something come up later on. Strategy, are we going to reduce that to the 10% from each one?
Yeah, so this is one of the things that we talked about in the retreat. So the first thing is that actually core tier 1 instruction, that base instruction of making sure that we have really strong ELA and math instruction is the first thing, right? Research consistently shows that if you don't have that, you can't remediate, you can't support out of it. And so that's the first thing. And that's why that was the first focus within the strategic plan. And that's actually why it was decided even before I joined here. So I'm going to ride on the coattails of others. That's why it was decided this year to focus on EL and CKLA. Next, not this coming year, but the following year, right? Once we have that base in, the initiative is around supporting our multilingual learners. And so that's what you see in year 2 is that. One of the things we're really careful about in this strategic plan is not trying to roll out 500 action steps.
Right.
And so what you'll see in year 2 is a committee coming together and saying, how do we really do this well? And what are the key actions? And so our director of ESOL for the elementary and our director of ESOL for the secondary will bring together a team, look at research, visit schools and say, what are best practices here and what do we need to do? And by then we'll have a data team that has the data that says, here's how our students are performing, has the M-class data that says, here's where our students are strong and here's where they're not. And we'll have the access data that says, here are our students that are making their year of growth and here are our students that are not. And so we can then dig in and say, what are the issues? And so I can't tell you standing here today exactly what the actions will be because it'll be developed in a year.
Exactly. Okay, understand. Right. So my last question is on the proposed measure.
Yep.
On the 101, I tried just to be a little more realistic here on the second bullet about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that means the percentage of students, the teachers, staff who are going to report to be encouraged to be engaged to the learning. So I feel like it's mostly, so we're getting more quantitative data here than qualitative on that aspect, that because engaging to the learning process is not meaning that I'm really applying that. So how can we capture that one then, be encouraged and really applying that one so we can see, the quality on the inclusion and equity and diversity and equity and inclusion.
And just tell me which initiative you're looking at.
Under 1/3, 101, 1.1.
1.1. And so it's the percent of staff who report that they've been encouraged.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to come up with a great measure to then say, what are we looking at to see that they're doing it in their classroom, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's
and so we wrestled with a couple of pieces. The hope is that we actually capture that on two measures that sit in other spots. So one of the measures is around staff or students reporting that they have an adult that they can talk to or that they have a sense of belonging with. And all of these measures, we should be able to break down by student demographic.
Right.
Right. And so we'll be able to see the qualitative, right? But then it's not necessarily going to answer the question, but it'll make us look and say, how does this look for students who identify as Black?
Mm-hmm.
Do they identify that they have a staff member that they can connect with? And then we can dig into that and actually look at it. And so that's where we'll be able to tell that. And that's a data point that we have within the mission measures. So we do have that within that.
Yeah, I just want to make sure because we have three categories here. We have the diversity, we have equity, and we have inclusion. So those are the three separate things. In my opinion, I just want to make sure that, because some of them, they can learn, be engaged, and really implement it. And some of those aspects is just getting the word around that, but never done anything. So when we collecting the quantitative only, the staff or employees or teachers been reporting that they've been engaged or going to around, that's why I try to see how can we measure that and bringing down to more a better qualitative aspect of the way to measure that.
Could I just add, I agree with you, and these are the year one internal measures. They will change, right? Like over time, those internal measures, could they be changed to be more towards action?
Yeah.
Well, they can adjust. There's also the case that there's other proxies for it, right? So part of it, right? Let's remember that these are about measuring the action. Like, are we doing the action? And then there's other measures that are about, is it having the impact?
Yes.
Right? Mm-hmm. And so those measures do exist, right? They exist on another slide that get at it. So it's designed to layer.
Okay.
Right? So I think this is what I'm trying to and I'm probably not just being clear enough, is are we doing the action, right? It's a qualitative piece. And then do students report a sense of belonging? And do they show up to school? Because we're looking at attendance. And do their academics approve? Because we're looking at their ELA and their math test scores. And so we're able to see each of those layers within this.
Okay.
But sometimes like when we've done progress monitoring with you so far, we stop at one of those layers. We say oh yeah, we're doing this, but do we know if it has an impact? And so we're trying to get to each of the layers, but we can also, if you want to give some another like example as we go through this to say, hey, how about we measure this? We can adjust this,
Okay.
right? This is designed to like be
Right.
a good proxy
Mm-hmm.
as a starting spot.
Yeah.
And then we may say, actually, like we have a walkthrough tool, right, that we're going to start to use next year. We may say, actually, let's look for this in that walkthrough tool as we're doing it.
Right.
And that could get at, is it
Exactly.
actually happening?
Yeah. Yeah. I really get the proxies on the process. I really see that. So let me just get the last final ones to see how often are we going to revise that? How often are we going to see those proposed measures?
So right now, the plan is that we're setting these as part of this and that we will be looking at these internally, right?
Right.
That we're using these to hold this accountable. And we got to figure out with Attuned and then with you, how we're going to progress monitor and share out.
Yeah.
We don't want to get to a spot where we're reporting this to you every week, right? We want to figure out the right cadence where you can do your governance and hold us accountable, right? There's got to be like that right balance. And I don't yet know exactly what that right balance is. And so I think over the next year, we'll have to like a little bit of triangulate or like iterate a little bit to find the right cadence.
Okay. Makes sense. Thank you.
I'm going to go to Board Member Billiou.
Thank you, Chair. So I don't have access to the strategic plan. I can see it on the presentation, but it's not on my board docs. So I'm just wondering if somebody can send that to me. And this is probably because I haven't been able to get into my account for the past however many years. I don't even know if we're still on that, but it would be great if I could get like a email of that information. And then I just wanted to make a comment that, or just from what I saw from the presentation, I really appreciate you taking the time to create this strategic plan. Sorry. I really appreciate like what I saw. I think it's a really good start. And I think doing the intentional work for us to have a place to start and go off from is really important. And I do want to comment on the fact of like calling it a Portland Promise 2.0. I don't think that's necessary. And I think that work has already been done and isn't really, I don't think they should be the same thing. And I think the Portland Promise should be different, or that this work should be seen as just our strategic planning and the work that we're doing internally. That could change any year. It's not going to always be the same, and it's not going to essentially have the same tone, because obviously there are things that we're going to need to change from our previous strategic planning going forth.
Thank you, Board Member Billiou. And I'm emailing you the documents from Board Docs right now. And
Thank you.
so you can reference those. Other questions, Board Member Opperman?
Something on the same line of evolving pieces of this. Do we have in the calendar a time, place to evaluate progress and see where things need to be changed or move forward? Are we set?
We haven't set them yet. We have
I'm just saying, so we don't say, oh gosh, we should have.
No, I mean, so we have the dates set, the tentative dates for the board, and we will, in that, then propose similar to what we did this year, but in a different iteration, really name out when we'll do progress monitoring, and then when we will review year 2 initiatives,
That's right.
and when we will sort of like put a pin in year 1 to acknowledge what was accomplished, what wasn't, that type of thing.
Yeah. Well, and that would happen February, that'll happen June,
I mean,
May.
I think we will really kick off year 2 initiatives in that February window.
Okay.
We will put a pin in sort of the year 1 initiatives in probably actually August, because it'll be when we'll have the data from year 1.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Other questions or needs from the board before this comes up for vote at the next meeting? Just double check online. Okay, if there are other needs or questions that come up, please feel free to reach out to Ryan in between. Beautiful. Thank you so much for all of the work, both you, Superintendent, and your team. The amount of work that's been condensed into these documents is pretty remarkable. And the fact that this plan, it feels overwhelming. I'm not going to lie that it doesn't feel overwhelming, but it's like good overwhelming because I think it really focuses on the things that we need to be focused on. So thank you for your work.
You're here.
And then we've got one last item to workshop tonight, which is the resolution for the Community Advisory Committee around configuration and boundaries. So I just wanted to give a little bit of context. I know I read the resolution and there's context there, but this is something that I brought forward working in tandem with Deputy Superintendent Townsend and the superintendent around, we have this big part of the strategic plan that is coming, and we want to make sure that we are deeply involving the community as we make a plan around the financial sustainability and really pinpointing systems and processes that could be changed or bettered for the long-term vision of the district. So this is the version that I brought forward. I think that there are people that would like to see it maybe different or have questions about the current resolution. So I would love to just have a conversation amongst the board to see kind of where people are in terms of, and I think the big question that I heard from a lot of folks was just the scope of what this committee is going to be looking at. I think kind of from my perspective, I wanted to cast a bigger net so that if, the data that the committee looks at gave us a recommendation that we haven't thought about or that we have, that could be included. But I also understand the notion of having a more specific scope of work for this committee. So I would love to just hear kind of like how folks have received this resolution and what they would like to see different. Yeah, go ahead, Board Member Figdor.
First, Chair, I want to thank you for bringing this forward. I think it's really critical to have the community be a real partner in this work. And so I was really happy when I first heard that you're bringing this forward. I think I had 3 responses to the actual resolution. And one, we've undertaken some really big chunks of work that are like just one part of this in recent years. And I really encourage us to not redo work that we've already done, but to build on what we've done. So Member Grant co-chaired a facilities and enrollment committee maybe 8 years ago.
Less.
Yeah, 2018.
Yeah, it was 6 years ago, I think.
So
Right before the pandemic.
I'll say like our enrollment hasn't changed much. There was a little dip, COVID, and we're back up a little bit. So overall, it hasn't changed much. So I think much of the work of that committee is probably still relevant. So I'd encourage us to build on that. And so and then another factor is the timeline for this is really short. Like to think that we're going to have the recommendations from this committee play into our budget process. Like there's no time here. So that to me says, let's have a tight mandate. And also I as a board member, I want to provide clarity to the community. Community members are going to come in from all different perspectives, and I want to be able to sit down and say, this is the work in front of you, and really be clear about what we're looking for as a board. We're not looking for the answers. We're looking for for them to take on a particular mandate. So that was and I can, as I see it, just coming out of the budget process, it was twofold. One around redistricting for pre-K to 8th grade. And the second was around kind of right-sizing our middle schools, just recognizing that we have a middle school model. And I know the superintendent through this budget process has been working towards this already of having kind of the different schools figure out how to kind of work, how to innovate the current model, but, you know, with the basic premise being that we have more middle school capacity than we have students enrolled. And so what changes can we make to right size middle school while you know, if anything, improving our delivery of, you know, our delivery. So ensuring that we're it's all it's maintaining all of the goals that we're working towards separately. Sorry, lost focus at 9:40 p.m.
No, we're still doing well. Okay, thank you. I appreciate all of those. Board Member Grant, I'll get to you in just a second. I appreciate all of those thoughts. I think one thing that I realized, because we have so many different versions of people that have been on the board, is the vocabulary within this resolution means different things to different people. So I do think it's worth like adding something that says, when we are talking about redistricting, what are we talking about? Is that the same thing as boundaries? Is that the same thing or different as reconfiguration and configuration? So I think I'd love to take another pass at that to just make it super clear what we mean when we use those words. And then Board Member Grant.
Well, that's a good segue to my comment, because to me, those things, two things are very different. And the remit for the group will be very different, and the politics of managing that will be very different, and the workload will be very different if reconfiguring is part of the process. Because there's no way to have that discussion without getting into the business of closing schools and significantly changing, you know, the education for lots and lots of people. My thought is that to make it fair to the 12 people who are going to put on this committee, it should be a narrow purpose. It should be just the boundaries or the line drawing, because to me, it's thinking back about the process of the last several months, that's the genesis for this, is to get the lines drawn so that our student population is leveled out among buildings. If you open the door to this, what I call the reconfiguration conversation, you're opening Pandora's box to a lot of big issues that are worth having. I just wouldn't have it with this group. If you want to get the line drawing done, just do the line drawing with this group and set off on a course to have the other conversations with either another committee or internally or some other way. I don't want to dismiss the need to do that, because I think Member Figdor pointed out all the reasons why that's necessary. But just having been part of the Facilities Commission, I did look it up. Our final report was in February of 2019, so it was right before the pandemic. That very quickly could have spiraled out of control, and it almost did, right? Because of all the different suggestions that came to the fore. I just wouldn't do that. If we really want to get the lines redrawn, let's just do that in column A and do the other things in column B or C.
Other thoughts? Yep, Board Member Opperman.
I think line drawing is a pretty simple and flexible and can make the difference one year and not the next. I look forward, and I agree. It's not something that can be done by November for the process, but a look at a reconfiguration of educationally of the student population. What I mean is we're doing a lot of pre-K. We want to expand pre-K. We have nowhere to put pre-K. So this is way out here, right? Elementary school that is perhaps smaller, you know, in the number of grades, changing what middle school looks like by virtue of age and all as we move in towards a high school. So it is a bigger revolution type thing, not to close school. I actually don't think we can afford to close a building anywhere because we haven't got any room for that, but to relook at which buildings are being used for what grades and what classes. So in that respect, changing lines might make a difference, but there might be other ways of looking at it. And perhaps it shouldn't go too far in, because I mean, as soon as you draw a line, and which side of Ludlow are you going to draw the line is there's politics, so.
Well, that's sort of my point, is that the line drawing is politically fraught. So let's just manage that issue and not tack on a bunch of other even more fraught issues.
That resonates a lot with me. And I think it is a big undertaking, and let's give it the space it deserves. And I think the clarity and having narrow purpose can really serve us well in this instance.
Other thoughts from board members here or online? Vice Chair Bondo?
Yeah, I just want to echo almost what we say, because I think clarity is what we need. Otherwise, we are all going to different directions and we're losing the focus on what we really want to see, because that's what I've been seeing most of the time when we are aligning with the community. So you have everybody, like each person or each community, they have their own way to see things and what they want to accomplish. So, I mean, we don't have to lose the focus on what we're looking for here. And I think the clarity and drawing lines is so important. So we have a direction, what we guiding the community, then we want to put together where we want them to go and which direction they have to follow, so that conversation can be really focused on the specific ones.
Mm-hmm. And do you have an opinion on which specific ones?
The pre-K configuration for our student population.
And just because we've had configuration used in multiple ways tonight, can you say more specifically what you mean by that?
I mean, we already have a couple of years ago, I don't know, if we already have some conversation around the reconfiguration of some of our elementary schools.
So I think Mickey's talking about Superintendent Batana's proposal to reconfigure our elementary schools, and we do have quite a lot of information around that, and did receive quite a lot of community, some community.
Yeah. And also want to just say that when we're talking about is about the space we are giving and the time frame that we're putting there, because I remember when we brought on the table, it was close to the budget season. But I mean, everything need to make sure, because that's the way people just bringing more issues, more challenges and more barriers, we can make those reconfiguration happening. So I mean, when we're drawing lines and be more clarity on what we're looking for, like, in our population, are we making sure we have a way we're doing boundaries? We're just moving boundaries, and are we sending our multi-population and what we have to different schools, so we can have a more equitable space, when they can have some more better learning process on different aspects of our different schools.
Yeah, so I think that is where I'm going in my head, is like returning to what is the issue that we're trying to solve by this committee coming together. And I would love, actually, Deputy Superintendent, if you wanted to jump in, or Superintendent also. But I think the impetus for this, in my mind, is that this work will help us prevent what was starting to happen at the high school level, where we were getting big masses of students in different populations in one, and that will impact equity. When we think about our definition of equity, right? We're also seeing that some schools' enrollment is way down because where people are living in Portland is different than it was 5-10 years ago, right? And so to me, this work is addressing that, to make sure that, again, we're going back to equity, that students have equal access to opportunities based on their identities, right? And for me, part of that is looking at the boundaries, right? So that we're looking at the enrollment both now and 5 years down the road. But I don't know how we do that without thinking about start and stop times and the other pieces that the Spanish immersion program, or other programs that go across pre-K through 8. I don't know how to just pull out the redistricting without looking at those other pieces too. And I'm totally open to that if we can come to agreement on what is the most important first layer, with maybe an intention to have a year 2 or year 3, and maybe we create that plan. I'm totally open to that, but I think there's a little bit more intertwining of these issues in service of the end goal, I guess, is where I'm from. So if you wanted to jump in, I'd love that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that actually, and it may go back to a little bit of what board member Figdor has said, is I think what may be the thing that's holding us back is thinking that it has to be done by February.
Yeah.
Is that if our restriction is that it has to be done by February, we're going to limit ourselves in terms of what we think about in terms of possibility. Because I do think we have to wrestle with the fact that we have schools that are close to 75, 80% low income. And we have schools that I think are right around 20%. We have schools that talk about really high percent of students that are multilingual, that are stretched really thin in terms of being able to support, and others that don't even need a multilingual teacher. And so this provides both richness and opportunity, as well as challenges that really throw off staffing ratios, et cetera. But there's also opportunity within that, right? So right now we have an outlier program, right? We have Spanish immersion at LISETH, right? I think there's real challenges in offering a Spanish immersion program, but our community also has real richness, right? So we could offer right now a dual language Arabic program that nobody else in the state could offer, that would be building off of the assets of our community. But the question of where does that sit and who gets opportunity to that would be something that would dramatically impact where we think about school space and programming. And so I think we'd be limiting ourselves, and we'd be right back at the drawing board if we only wrestled with the question of where's the boundary, because what we'd really be answering is Roe. Just to be honest, we'd be answering Roe, Longfellow, Presumpscot as sort of like, and Reiki as like real pinch points right now, and then some other pieces on the margin.
And we closed Nathan Clifford, which was my neighborhood school, and that hadn't been happened, none of this would have happened.
See, you're going to have to teach me about that, because I don't even know what you're talking about right now, because I'm too new here, right?
It was next meeting.
But like, I think there's some opportunities that if we expanded the window, and the truth of the matter is, I think the last time the study happened on it, the budget savings weren't that astronomical, that it changes it. So I think there's a way to think about some short-term pressure pieces, right? Which is around some immediate pieces around where there's some serious overcrowding and some issues around Reiki and Roe that we need to address in the short term, right? That there's a short-term charge for the committee. And then there's a long-term piece, right? In the same way that we're dreaming a little bit around high school for the future, there's some pieces that maybe that's the question. And maybe we need to go back to the drawing board and think about what's the charge here that allows us to offer stuff that gets folks to say, wow, Portland Public Schools has this, nobody else can offer it.
I just want to make sure the first part happens.
Yeah.
And that
was the start of this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if there's a way, I mean, I don't really care if it's one committee or three committees, or if it's part one and part two, like, I don't really care about that. But I don't want to see the necessity of the lines being redrawn to fix these immediate problems subsumed by all the issues that you're going to open up by having the reconfiguration question, which is a question that should be asked. Like, I'm not saying no to that. Just politics are going to be messy if you do try to do both at the same time.
Yeah. Board member
I guess I don't know what the reconfigure question is. Like, I don't have clarity. Like, Superintendent, I hear you, but I don't know what you're talking about specifically. Like, I
don't either.
Okay.
I'm not coming to this with an answer.
I don't know that we can,
yeah.
I don't like, I don't feel comfortable charging a committee with the unknown, right? So, like, let's figure out, as Board Member Grant is saying, let's figure out like what the initial charge is, and then go from there.
And service of. Yeah. And I just want to get Deputy Superintendent, because you'll be holding some of this work. So I just love to get your voice and perspective in here.
Yeah, no, appreciating this conversation so it can help focus. I think the only things I would, or just a couple things briefly, is one, just very much see it as kind of building off of kind of the prior work. So there was the enrollment and facility study that Member Grant chaired, 2018-19, have all of that data. It doesn't feel like, we can build on that. There've been slight, obviously the BFLF schools, right, need a little bit of updating, but by and large, we have that data to revisit. We've had the ongoing relationship with Davis Demographics, right? So we're ready to kind of like re-engage with some of that. So I do think, particularly as it relates to the boundary question, we have data ready that's pretty actionable to kind of get into that conversation. Obviously, the community engagement around it is another part of that puzzle. And I think the other thing I guess I would say is like, so there was that. And then in 2013, prior and led into BFOF, there was another effort at this. So there's a cyclical effort at looking, which I think is healthy, right? And appropriate. What is our portfolio? Where are we at, right? How do we kind of consider this? So I do see it as kind of building upon and a healthy practice for the district to assess and analyze where are we at? What should our portfolio look like? Totally open to this conversation about how we specify and what the kind of sequence of taking those things up might be, because I do think, as I was thinking about it, right, that, yeah, there are some immediate kind of things, but, that we could implement to the notion of kind of like, what's the right time frame? The enrollment boundary changes being not easy, but more actionable than a potential full reconfiguration in all of the logistics that might go into, what was the proposal of, I believe it was like March 10th, 2020, right? No, I'm now getting myself confused.
It was
2019?
talked about over a couple of years.
No, 2020. Yeah, it was right before, literally, that was proposed 2 days before we 3 days before we shut down schools, and we just tabled it. So it's felt like, I think, this question of there have been a few things kind of tabled from those successive things, and have come up in subsequent, with the budgetary pressures. I remember last year, here's a list of things, right? There was the budget work group, right? There have been a number of things that have felt kind of tabled for some time. And I mean, how we get at that work, obviously, this is what we're discussing to kind of talk through, but it feels like that just kind of got tabled and sat there. And I hear people talk about it at different points, right? And things like that. So wondering what's the venue to kind of bring those forward.
Board Member
I
Fickler?
guess my question is what, and I hear the like always reconsider your portfolio and sure. But on the flip side, like what is the impetus? Like what is the motivation? Because at the time that we were considering elementary school reconfiguration, so having just so that we're all having the same conversation. So it was making some of our elementary school pre-K to second, and the rest of our elementary schools grades 3 to 5. And so kids would go to one elementary school for pre-K or K through 2, and a different elementary school for 3 to 5. And I just want to articulate that so we're all talking about the same thing. And the impetus at that point was to save money. And I do think that during the budget process, we didn't talk about that as a money saving initiative or possibility. We talked about 3 other things: moving middle schoolers to public transit, shifting our middle school model to better reflect our current enrollment, and moving to try to build the infrastructure to reimburse more for Maine care. So my question is like, what's the impetus? And and I do think like Aaron will tell you that there are I think there's like some specialization it's not just about money. If you like specialize in a certain grade area, in a narrow band of grades, you might get better at that. Yeah. But there's also big challenges, like there's learning loss when kids move from one school to the next. So there's not real clarity as I remember it, in terms of like the academic benefits or the equity benefits necessarily. Well, maybe you could say they're equity benefits if you're getting better at delivering. So,
I mean, just briefly, it didn't completely, and this is where it needs to kind of, potentially needs to see the light of day again, just of making progress towards some of the disparities that exist demographically across our elementary schools was one of.
But wouldn't we do that in redistricting?
Well, I think that's the question, I think, and that's where I think with
Yeah.
Chair Lentz's comment, it's like everything's so intertwined, right, a little bit? Like, we could, maybe some, but, there we're fighting entrenched just geographic realities that I don't know. We need to go through it, but I wonder if that's going to limit how much we can impact that. Maybe not, right? Maybe there's a certain segment and a certain way to shift it that does have a demonstrable impact, but I'm not sure, right, at this juncture.
Board Member Opperman?
Thank you, Chair. I hear everything that's going on, and I understand, and I remember the discussions going on with the shifting and all. I think whatever a particular resolution or any committee should be focusing on what is the best academically, socially for the students. Some of the pressure that we had this budget season was, my school doesn't have as many teachers anymore. They're leaving because we don't have as many kids in the school. So ship some kids over to us was the attitude. Well, it sounds a whole lot like when I grew up in college in Boston. And so, that doesn't always work very well. So I think I see some academic benefits from what the original redistricting reconfiguration of K3, pre-K3, because of the academic patterning and all. I also see problems at the middle school, 6th graders to 8th graders, huge change in students. And so, looking at their needs differently and seeing what could be the better way of meeting those needs. So I don't think it's a small situation. I think if we're going to jump on because somebody's upset that their school is little is a problem. If we're worried about space, moving the 5th grade, whole 5th grade class away from one building to another might make a difference. So, there's lots of ways of looking at this, but to do it from an academic way, not just it. I don't think economically it's not going to make any difference one way, however we put it together. That's my 2 cents.
Again, I think that they're very intertwined. I guess when we're thinking about the budget for next year, like, what are the pieces that we need to be able to have clarity on for the budget next year if we can't get to 100% clarity? Like what is the logical order to attack these in? Because I think what I'm hearing is I don't want to not name all these things, but I want to start with the redistricting and then move out from that. And I think if we could name kind of like a logical order, that makes sense.
I think the base piece of students in school, right? So the count of where we're really at. So I think it goes back to Board Member Grant's piece of what's the line and how many kids are at school, so we can really have a sense of how many cohorts are we talking about, how many classes are we talking about, and what's the profile of those students, so we can do that.
And I think if we added into the resolution that that's what the work of this committee is, but that they could identify additional challenges or topics that need to come next to be solved to make the redistricting possible. Does that, I'm seeing lots of nods of heads.
Yeah, that's fine for me. And if
Yeah.
I may just jump in, in listening to this discussion, these big ideas about reforming or how we restructuring, reconfiguring, I would want to see them come from the superintendent's office first. I don't want to give a committee a blank canvas and say, go think about reconfiguration, because you're going to get pitchforks in the street because people are going to think we're going to end the neighborhood elementary school system. That's immediately what's going to happen, because that's what happens when you go to the K to 2, 3 to 5 model. So I would much rather see a more defined bunch of options from the central office and say, okay, now now this committee, here's your second phase. We've got some ideas, and you're the ones who know where all the dominoes that fall if you move something here and 7 things move over here. You're the ones who are going to know that. So I would rather see a much more staff-driven set of ideas if we're going to go down that road that follows moving the lines around. Because I'm actually a little more bullish about moving the lines, because I think every day that goes by, Portland's more diverse, and I think you get the gerrymander is going to have to be far less severe than it would have been even 10 years ago. So,
Yes, Board Member Victor.
That makes sense to me. And one just quick comment is I don't, I want to also be clear about what we're asking people to sign up for.
Yep.
But other than that, I wonder if, a small group of us wants to go and work on the next version of this resolution, and I'd be happy to
Yep.
help out if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that does make sense. And I think it makes sense to kind of socialize the amended version of this resolution before the next meeting so that we can do the vote and stay on track of getting the committee together over the summer. But just if anyone is interested in working on that resolution, please raise your hand. I'm happy to continue to work. Yeah, okay, beautiful. I think that makes sense. Just really appreciate all of your thoughts and contributions to this conversation. I think we got to a much better place, so just appreciate it. I think we just finished.